David, and I met in college. He was studying business, I was in marketing. He was the kind of guy who had a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, and probably knew what he wanted to be doing when he retired. I loved that about him, his certainty, his drive, his ability to make decisions and stick with them. When he proposed after graduation, it felt like the natural next step. We moved in together, got married 2 years later, bought our house, and started talking about kids almost immediately. Everyone said we were the perfect couple. We looked good together in photos. We had similar goals. We never fought in public. But perfect couples don't exist, do they? They just exist in the spaces between the real moments, in the carefully curated versions of ourselves we show the world. The first crack appeared when I got pregnant for the first time.
We were so excited.
David started researching cribs and car seats immediately. I began taking prenatal vitamins and reading every pregnancy book I could find. We told our families at 8 weeks, even though everyone says to wait until 12. I lost the baby at 10 weeks. The doctor said it was common, that these things happen, that there was nothing we could have done differently. David held my hand in the hospital room and told me we'd try again when I was ready. He was supportive, loving even. But I could see something change in his eyes, a kind of wariness, like he was protecting himself from getting too excited the next time. 6 months later, I got pregnant again. This time, we waited until 12 weeks to tell anyone. This time, we were more cautious with our excitement. This time, we thought we were safe. I lost that baby at 14 weeks. That's when everything changed. David didn't hold my hand the same way after the second miscarriage. He still said the right things. We'll get through this. It's not your fault. The doctor said we can try again, but there was a distance in his voice that hadn't been there before. Like he was reading from a script instead of speaking from his heart. I blamed myself completely. Maybe I had exercised too much. Maybe I hadn't eaten enough of the right foods. Maybe my body was just broken, defective, unable to do the one thing it was supposed to do naturally. I spent hours researching fertility, nutrition, stress reduction. I scheduled appointments with specialists. I bought supplements and teas and books about preparing your body for pregnancy. David went along with all of it, but I could feel him pulling away. He started working later. He'd come home exhausted and distracted, scrolling through his phone during dinner, falling asleep on the couch while I was talking to him. When I tried to bring up the elephant in the room, our losses, our future plans, how we were handling everything, he'd change the subject or say he needed to check something for work. The silence between us grew heavier each day. We stopped having morning conversations over coffee. We stopped planning weekend activities together. We stopped talking about the future entirely. We were like two people living in the same house, sharing the same space, but existing in completely separate worlds. I felt invisible, not just to David but to everyone. At work, I was going through the motions. With friends, I was pretending everything was fine. At family gatherings, I was deflecting questions about when we were going to have kids. I felt like I was disappearing, like I was becoming a ghost of myself. That's when I decided I needed to do something drastic. I needed to feel like myself again, or at least remember who I used to be. The gym I chose wasn't one of those budget chains with rows of machines and fluorescent lighting. It was called Elite Fitness and Wellness, and it looked more like a spa than a traditional gym. Floor-to-ceiling windows, polished concrete floors, modern equipment that looked like art installations. They offered personal training, nutrition coaching, massage therapy, even meditation classes. I'd driven past it dozens of times on my way to work, always telling myself I should check it out. The membership fee was steep, more than David and I usually spent on entertainment in a month, but I needed something that felt like an investment in myself. Something that would force me to show up and put effort into my own well-being. My first day was intimidating. Everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing, moving from machine to machine, with confidence. I felt self-conscious in my old workout clothes, unsure of proper form, overwhelmed by all the options. I spent 20 minutes on a treadmill and left, promising myself I'd figure it out as I went along. The second day was different. I was struggling with a rowing machine, trying to figure out the proper technique, when someone approached me from behind. "Mind if I give you a quick tip?" I turned around and saw him for the first time. Tall, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders and the kind of build that came from years of dedicated training, not just good genetics. His skin was a warm caramel tone, and he had deep brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He was wearing a black polo shirt with the gym's logo, so I knew he worked there. "Please," I said, stepping back from the machine. "I have no idea what I'm doing." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. "I'm Trey. I'm one of the trainers here. And don't worry, everyone starts somewhere." He showed me how to adjust the footrests, how to position my back, how to coordinate the pull with my legs. As he demonstrated, I found myself noticing details about him. The way his forearms moved as he gripped the handle, the patience in his voice as he explained the technique, the way he stepped back to give me space to try it myself. "Better," he said after I completed a few rows. "You're a natural." I laughed. I don't feel like a natural at anything these days. Something in my voice must have caught his attention, because he tilted his head slightly and looked at me with what seemed like genuine concern. "Rough patch?" he asked gently. I was surprised by how much I wanted to tell him everything. This stranger who had just helped me with a rowing machine, and I was already fighting the urge to unload all my problems on him. Instead, I just nodded. "Well," he said, "exercise is great therapy. And if you ever want some guidance, I do personal training sessions. Nothing intense, just helping people figure out what works for their goals and their bodies." He handed me his business card. It was simple, elegant, just his name, title, and contact information. Think about it. First consultation is always free. As I walked to my car that day, I found myself thinking about the way he'd looked at me. Not like I was broken or fragile, the way David had been looking at me for months. Not with pity or awkwardness, the way our friends looked at me when they didn't know what to say about our losses. Trey had looked at me like I was worth paying attention to. I kept the card. I waited 3 days before texting him. I must have typed and deleted the message a dozen times, trying to find the right tone. Too casual might seem dismissive. Too formal might seem weird. Too eager might seem desperate. Finally, I settled on, "Hi Trey, this is Vanessa from the gym. I'd like to take you up on that free consultation if the offer is still available." He responded within an hour. "Of course. When works best for you. I have availability most weekday mornings and early evenings." We scheduled a session for Thursday at 6 p.m. I told David I was meeting with a trainer to get a proper workout plan, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. He barely looked up from his laptop when I mentioned it. "That's good," he said absently. "You should do whatever makes you feel better." The gym was quieter in the evening. Most of the after-work crowd had already finished their routines and headed home. Trey met me at the front desk wearing athletic shorts and a fitted t-shirt that showed off his physique without being excessive. He looked professional but approachable. "Ready to get started?" he asked. He led me to a quieter section of the gym where the personal training area was set up. There were mats, stability balls, resistance bands, and mirrors along the walls. It felt more intimate than the main gym floor, designed for one-on-one attention. "So," he said, pulling up 2 chairs so we could sit facing each other, "tell me about your goals. What are you hoping to accomplish?" I prepared for this question, but sitting across from him, his full attention focused on me, I found myself being more honest than I'd planned. "I want to feel strong again," I said. "Not just physically, but I don't know. I've been going through some difficult things lately, and I feel like I've lost myself somewhere along the way. I thought maybe if I could get back in shape, take care of my body better, I might start feeling more like me again." He nodded thoughtfully. "That makes total sense. Our physical health and mental health are completely connected. When we're not taking care of one, the other suffers too." He asked about my exercise history, any injuries, what kinds of activities I enjoyed. He was thorough but not invasive, professional but warm. When I mentioned that I used to dance in college, his face lit up. "That's perfect," he said. "Dancers have great body awareness and flexibility. We can definitely build on that foundation." He had me do some basic movements so he could assess my current fitness level and identify any imbalances or areas that needed attention. As I moved through the exercises, squats, lunges, arm circles, planks, he watched carefully, occasionally adjusting my form with gentle corrections. "You carry a lot of tension in your shoulders," he observed as I held a plank position. "That's really common in people who are dealing with stress. Your body holds onto emotional tension just as much as physical tension." When I finished the assessment, we sat back down to discuss a training plan. He suggested meeting twice a week to start, focusing on building strength and flexibility while incorporating stress relief techniques like yoga and stretching. "I want to make sure this feels sustainable for you," he said. "The goal isn't to exhaust you or make you dread coming here. It's to help you reconnect with your body in a positive way." As we talked, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. He was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in helping me succeed, and he had a way of making me feel heard and understood. When he smiled, it reached his eyes. When he laughed at something I said, it felt genuine. "There's one more thing I want to mention," he said as we wrapped up the consultation. "I know you said you're going through some difficult things right now. I want you to know that whatever brought you here, whatever you're dealing with, this space is going to be just for you. When you're here, you don't have to be anything for anyone else. You can just focus on yourself." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. It had been so long since anyone had said something like that to me. So long since someone had seen that I was struggling and offered me permission to put myself first. "Thank you," I managed to say. I really needed to hear that. We scheduled our first official training session for the following Tuesday. As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Something to look forward to that was just mine. The first few training sessions were exactly what I needed. Trey was professional, encouraging, and incredibly knowledgeable. He designed workouts that challenged me without overwhelming me, and he had a gift for knowing when to push and when to pull back. But more than the physical training, it was the attention that I craved. For 1 hour, twice a week, someone was completely focused on me. On my form, my progress, my needs, my goals. He remembered details from our previous conversations. He noticed when I seemed stressed or distracted. He celebrated small victories with genuine enthusiasm. "Your posture is so much better than when we started," he'd say. Or, "I can tell you've been practicing those stretches at home. Your flexibility has really improved." It was intoxicating to feel seen and appreciated again. After about a month of regular sessions, Trey suggested adding some mobility work to address the tension I carried in my shoulders and hips. "Flexibility training is just as important as strength training," he explained. "And given everything you've been dealing with, I think some focused stretching and relaxation techniques could really help." He recommended we add a third session each week, specifically focused on stretching and mobility. These sessions would be longer, 90 minutes instead of 60, and would take place in a yoga studio adjacent to the main gym. It was a smaller, more intimate space with soft lighting and calming music. I agreed immediately. The regular training sessions had become the highlight of my week. The idea of spending even more time working on myself in that peaceful environment, with someone who seemed to genuinely care about my well-being, felt like exactly what I needed. David was supportive of the additional sessions, though in his distracted way. "If it's helping, then it's worth the investment," he said when I mentioned the increased cost. I realized he was probably just relieved that I seemed less sad and anxious than I had been in months. The first stretching session was different from our regular training. The yoga studio was dimly lit, with candles placed around the room and soft instrumental music playing through speakers I couldn't see. Trey had me start with some basic yoga poses to warm up, then moved into deeper stretches designed to release tension. As he guided me through the positions, he would occasionally adjust my form with his hands, a gentle pressure on my lower back to deepen a forward fold, his hands on my hips to help me maintain proper alignment in a lunge, his palm between my shoulder blades to encourage me to relax into a twist. "You hold so much stress right here," he said during one stretch, his fingers pressing gently into a knot of tension at the base of my neck. This is where emotional stress manifests physically for a lot of people. His touch was professional but personal, clinical but caring. I found myself looking forward to these adjustments, to the momentary connection, and the relief they brought. After about 20 minutes of active stretching, He had me lie down on a yoga mat for what he called restorative poses, positions designed to help the nervous system relax and reset. "This is where the real healing happens," he said as he placed a bolster under my knees and a lavender-scented eye pillow over my eyes. "When we give our bodies permission to completely let go." As I lay there in the darkened room, focusing on my breathing, I felt safer and more peaceful than I had in months. When the session ended, I almost didn't want to leave. "How do you feel?" Trey asked as I slowly sat up. "Amazing," I said honestly. "Like I've been carrying around this heavy backpack for months, and someone just helped me take it off." He smiled. "That's exactly the goal. Your body has been in survival mode for so long, it forgot how to relax. We're just reminding it how." Over the next few weeks, these stretching sessions became even more important to me than the strength training. There was something about the combination of the peaceful environment, the focused attention, and the physical release that felt like medicine for my soul. But I also started to notice that the sessions were becoming more intimate. Not in an obvious way, but in small increments that I almost didn't recognize at first. The adjustments lasted a little longer. His hands would linger on my back or shoulders as he helped me into a stretch. During the restorative portions, he would sometimes sit next to my mat, close enough that I could feel his presence, and he'd speak in a low, soothing voice about letting go of whatever was weighing on me. "You deserve to feel peaceful," he'd say. "You deserve to feel taken care of. You don't have to carry everyone else's expectations," he'd whisper as I relaxed into a supported child's pose. "You can just be yourself here." I told myself it was all part of the therapeutic process. He was a professional who understood how to create a safe space for healing. The attention he was giving me was exactly what I needed, someone who saw me as worthy of care and focused effort. But deep down, I knew something was shifting. The way he looked at me had changed. The way I looked forward to our sessions had changed. The way I thought about him when I wasn't at the gym had definitely changed. And I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. It was a Thursday evening in late October. I'd been training with Trey for almost 3 months, and our relationship had developed a rhythm of professional intimacy that I'd grown to depend on. David was working late again. He'd been pulling 12-hour days on a major project, and I'd scheduled a stretching session for 7 p.m. when the gym would be nearly empty. I arrived to find that we were practically alone. A few people were finishing up their workouts on the main floor, but the yoga studio was completely private, tucked away from the main gym area, with frosted glass doors that provided privacy, while still letting in light from the hallway. "Long day?" Trey asked as I set my water bottle down and began to remove my shoes. "Long month," I replied with a tired smile. "David's been practically living at the office, and I feel like I'm just floating." He nodded with understanding. Over the weeks, I'd shared more about my situation at home. Not the details of our losses, but the growing distance between David and me, the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible in my own life. "Well," he said, dimming the lights to their usual low setting and starting the soft music, "this is your time. Everything else can wait outside this room." We began with our usual warm-up routine, but I could tell he was paying even closer attention to my body language than normal. As we moved through some gentle stretches, he kept asking how I was feeling, if I needed more support, if I wanted to try deeper variations of the poses. "You seem tighter than usual," he observed as I struggled through a seated spinal twist. "Here, let me help." He positioned himself behind me on the mat, his legs on either side of mine, his chest against my back. I could feel the warmth of his body as he placed one hand on my thigh and the other on my shoulder blade, gently encouraging the twist while supporting my torso. "Breathe into it," he said softly, his voice right next to my ear. "Don't force it. Just let it happen." I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the stretch, but I was intensely aware of his proximity. His breath on my neck, his hands providing steady pressure, the solid feeling of his body supporting mine. I felt safe and vulnerable at the same time. "Better?" he asked, and I could hear something different in his voice, a gentleness that seemed more personal than professional. "Much better," I whispered. He held the position for longer than usual, and when he finally released the stretch, his hands remained on my shoulders for several moments. I should have moved away, created some space, maintain the professional boundary that had been blurring for weeks. Instead, I found myself leaning back slightly into his chest. "Vanessa," he said quietly, and my name in his voice sounded different than it ever had before. I turned my head slightly to look at him and found his face inches from mine. His expression was serious, searching, like he was asking a question without words. "I shouldn't," I started to say, but the words trailed off because I wasn't sure what I shouldn't do. I shouldn't be enjoying this so much. I shouldn't want more. I shouldn't be thinking about what it would feel like if he kissed me. "You shouldn't what?" he asked gently, his eyes moving to my lips and then back to my eyes. Instead of answering, I turned more fully to face him. We were sitting cross-legged on the yoga mat, knees almost touching, the space between us charged with tension and possibility. "I shouldn't want this," I said finally honestly. "What do you want?" he asked, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers grazed my cheek as he pulled his hand back, and the simple touch sent electricity through my entire body. I couldn't say it out loud. I couldn't admit that I wanted him to touch me, to see me, to make me feel like a desirable woman instead of a broken wife. I couldn't confess that I thought about him constantly, that I looked forward to our sessions in a way that had nothing to do with fitness and everything to do with the way he made me feel alive again. Instead, I just looked at him, hoping he could read the answer in my eyes. He leaned forward slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to say no, to maintain the boundary we were about to cross. But I didn't want to say no. For the first time in months, I wanted to say yes to something. When his lips touched mine, it was gentle at first, questioning, careful. But when I kissed him back, everything changed. Months of loneliness and frustration and feeling unwanted poured into that kiss. His hands moved to my face, my hair, and I felt like I was waking up from a long, cold sleep. "We should stop," he whispered against my lips, but his hands were pulling me closer even as he said it. "I know," I whispered back, but I was already moving toward him, letting him guide me down onto the mat. What happened next was slow and deliberate, and completely different from anything I'd experienced in years. He touched me like he was memorizing every detail, looked at me like I was something precious and rare. He told me I was beautiful, that I deserved to be worshipped, that my husband was a fool for not seeing what he had. Afterward, as we lay together in the dim light of the yoga studio, I felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was like. Complete, total contentment. For the first time in months, my mind wasn't racing with anxiety or guilt or sadness. I felt peaceful, satisfied, cherished. "Are you okay?" Trey asked, his fingers tracing patterns on my shoulder. "I'm perfect," I said and meant it. But as I drove home that night, reality began to creep back in. I was married. I had just cheated on my husband with my personal trainer in a yoga studio. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made a choice that couldn't be undone. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the contentment had been replaced by a familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. David's car was already there. He'd made it home before me for once. "How was your session?" he asked when I walked into the kitchen, not looking up from the sandwich he was making. "Good," I said, hoping my voice sounded normal. "Really good." And the terrible thing was, that was the truth. I told myself it was a one-time mistake. As I lay in bed next to David that night, listening to him breathe in his sleep, I made a dozen promises to myself. I would cancel my remaining training sessions with Trey. I would transfer to a different trainer, or better yet, a different gym entirely. I would focus on my marriage, have an honest conversation with David about how disconnected we'd become, suggest couples therapy. But when Thursday came around again, I found myself driving to the gym at our usual time. Trey was waiting for me in the yoga studio, and the moment our eyes met, I knew that all my resolutions had been meaningless. The way he looked at me, like I was the most important person in his world, was intoxicating. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted like that. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said as I set down my gym bag. "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. And now, I looked around the familiar space, the soft lighting, the mirrors, the mats where we'd crossed every professional boundary the week before. I knew I should leave. I knew I should tell him we'd made a mistake and it couldn't happen again. I knew I should protect my marriage and my integrity and my sense of who I was as a person. Instead, I stepped closer to him. "Now I'm here," I said simply. That became our pattern. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times, I would drive to Elite Fitness for what anyone looking at my schedule would assume were personal training sessions. And they were, in a way, just not the kind I'd originally signed up for. Trey was incredibly careful about maintaining appearances. To anyone watching, we looked like trainer and client. He would greet me professionally in the main gym area, lead me through a legitimate warm-up routine where others could see us, and then we'd move to the private yoga studio for advanced stretching and flexibility work. Once we were alone, everything changed. The professional facade would drop, and he'd become the attentive, passionate man who made me feel like the center of the universe. He would touch me like I was something precious, tell me things about my body that David hadn't said in years, make me feel beautiful and desired and worthy of devotion. "Your husband doesn't see you," he'd whisper as his hands traced the curves of my waist. "He doesn't appreciate what he has." "You're incredible," he'd say, looking into my eyes with an intensity that made my heart race. "You deserve so much better than being ignored." It wasn't just the physical intimacy, though that was unlike anything I'd experienced in my marriage. It was the way he paid attention to me. He remembered details about my day, asked about things I'd mentioned in passing, noticed when I seemed stressed or sad. He made me feel heard, seen, important. During the weeks we were together, I felt like myself again for the first time since the miscarriages. I had energy, confidence, something to look forward to. I started taking more care with my appearance, not just for our sessions but in general. I bought new clothes, got a different haircut, wore makeup more often. People at work commented that I seemed happier, more vibrant. David noticed too, in his distracted way. "You look good," he said one evening as I was getting ready for a dinner with friends. "The gym is really working for you." "Thanks," I said, and I could hear the guilt in my own voice. But he was already turning back to his laptop, already moving on to the next item on his mental checklist. That was the problem, I told myself. David was so busy, so focused on his work and his goals and his plans, that he couldn't see what was happening right in front of him. He couldn't see that his wife was slipping away, finding attention and affection somewhere else. It was easier to blame him than to face what I was really doing. The sessions with Trey became the highlight of my week, the thing that made everything else bearable. I started scheduling other parts of my life around them, making sure I had time to get ready beforehand and decompress afterward. I bought new workout clothes that I knew he'd like. I changed my perfume to something more subtle, but still noticeable. I was falling for him, and I knew it, and I didn't want to stop. About 6 weeks into our affair, Trey suggested meeting somewhere other than the gym. "I hate that we have to sneak around," he said as we lay together on the yoga mat after a particularly intense session. "I hate that we only have these stolen moments." "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though my heart was already racing with the possibility. "I have a studio apartment downtown," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's private. We could have more time together, more space to just be ourselves." I knew it was a terrible idea. Meeting at the gym felt somehow safer, more contained. There were people around, time limits, the pretense of legitimate training sessions. Going to his apartment would be crossing another line, making our affair feel more real, more intentional. "I don't know," I said hesitantly. He turned onto his side to face me, his hand tracing the line of my jaw. "I'm not trying to pressure you. I just want more time with you. You're incredible, Vanessa, and an hour twice a week isn't enough." The way he said my name, the longing in his voice, the implication that he wanted more of me, it was overwhelming and irresistible. "Okay," I heard myself say, "but just once, to see how it feels." His apartment was a small studio in a converted warehouse building downtown. It was masculine and minimal, a Murphy bed, a small kitchen, a single chair, and windows that faced the city skyline. It felt like a secret hideaway, completely separate from my real life. "This is where I come when I need to think," he said as he poured us each a glass of wine. "It's the only place that feels completely mine." Being there with him felt dangerous and exciting and completely surreal. For 2 hours, I could pretend I was someone else, a woman who was single, available, free to explore this connection without guilt or consequences. We talked more than we ever had at the gym. He told me about his childhood, his dreams of opening his own fitness studio, his past relationships. I found myself sharing things I hadn't told anyone. My fears about never having children, my growing loneliness in my marriage, my sense that I was disappearing into a life that didn't feel like mine anymore. "You're not disappearing," he said, pulling me closer on the small couch. "You're just figuring out who you really are underneath all the expectations and roles other people have put on you." When we made love that afternoon, it was different than it had been in the yoga studio. More tender, more intimate, more like what I imagined love was supposed to feel like. Driving home afterward, I felt like I was living a double life. In Trey's apartment, I was a vibrant, desirable woman worthy of passion and attention. In my house with David, I was a wife going through the motions, pretending everything was normal while harboring a secret that grew larger every day. The studio apartment became our regular meeting place. I would tell David I was going to longer training sessions, or meeting a friend for lunch, or running errands that would take a few hours. He never questioned the details, never seemed suspicious of my explanations. For 2 months, I lived in this parallel world where I was loved and wanted and seen. For 2 months, I convinced myself that what I was doing wasn't really hurting anyone. David was too busy to notice my absence, too distracted to see the changes in me. As long as I kept our affairs separate from my marriage, as long as I maintained the facade at home, I could have both lives. I should have known it couldn't last. I should have known that secrets that big have a way of revealing themselves. I should have known that Trey's attention, as intoxicating as it was, might not be as exclusive as I'd believed. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday afternoon in early February. I'd arrived at the gym for what I thought was our regular session, but Trey wasn't at the front desk or in the training area where we usually met. I waited for about 10 minutes before approaching one of the other trainers. "Have you seen Trey?" I asked casually. "We had a session scheduled for 2 p.m. "Oh, he had to reschedule some appointments today," the trainer said. "Family emergency or something. Didn't he contact you?" My phone hadn't buzzed with any messages, but I checked it again to be sure. Nothing from Trey. No missed calls, no texts, no explanation for why he'd stood me up. I tried to play it off as no big deal. These things happen, people have emergencies, he'd probably reach out later to explain and reschedule. But as I drove home, I felt a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach that had nothing to do with being inconvenienced and everything to do with how much I'd been looking forward to seeing him. When had I become so dependent on these sessions? When had Trey's attention become something I couldn't go a few days without? He texted me that evening. "So sorry about today. Something came up last minute. Can we meet Thursday at the usual time?" No explanation, no details about the emergency, just a brief apology and a request to reschedule. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. He didn't know me his personal business, and it was probably something he didn't want to discuss over text. But when Thursday came, something felt different. Trey was friendly and professional, but there was a distance that hadn't been there before. During our session, his attention seemed divided, like his mind was somewhere else. "Is everything okay?" I asked as we were finishing up at his apartment afterward. "Of course," he said, but he was already getting dressed, already creating physical space between us. "Why?" "You just seem distracted today." He kissed my forehead in a way that felt more dismissive than affectionate. "Just work stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." But I was worrying. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small changes in our routine. Sessions that ran shorter than usual. Less conversation during our time together. A sense that he was going through the motions rather than being fully present with me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into normal fluctuations in someone's mood and attention. But the doubt had been planted, and it grew larger with each interaction. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in late February. I'd finished my session with Trey and realized I'd left my phone in the yoga studio. I drove back to the gym, used my member key card to get in through the after-hours entrance, and made my way to the studio to retrieve it. As I approached the frosted glass doors, I could hear voices inside, Trey's voice, and a woman's voice I didn't recognize. I told myself they were probably just having a consultation, that there was a perfectly innocent explanation for why he was in the studio with another client after hours. But something made me stop and listen. "You're so tense," I heard Trey say in the same gentle, concerned tone he'd used with me countless times. "All this stress you're carrying, it's not good for your body or your mind." "I know," the woman replied. I feel like I'm falling apart. Like everything in my life is going wrong at once." "Hey," Trey said, and I could hear the sound of movement, fabric against fabric. "You're not falling apart. You're just going through a difficult time. But you're stronger than you know." My heart started racing. The conversation sounded eerily familiar, like dozens of conversations Trey and I had shared during our early sessions together. "Really?" the woman asked, her voice vulnerable in a way that made my stomach clench. "Really," Trey confirmed. "You deserve better than what you're dealing with at home. You deserve to be seen, appreciated, cherished." I felt like I was going to be sick. Those were almost the exact words he'd said to me. The same tone, the same progression, the same careful seduction disguised as support and understanding. I should have walked away. I should have grabbed my phone and left before I heard anything else. Instead, I found myself moving closer to the glass, positioning myself where I could see into the studio without being seen. The woman was blonde, probably in her early 30s, attractive in a wholesome way. She was lying on a yoga mat in workout clothes, and Trey was kneeling beside her, his hands on her shoulders in a position I recognized from our own sessions. "Just breathe," he was saying. "Let me help you release some of this tension." His hands moved to her lower back, pressing and massaging in a way that was clearly more intimate than therapeutic. The woman's eyes were closed, and she was making soft sounds of pleasure and relief that I remembered making myself in that same position. "Better?" Trey asked, his voice lower now, more personal. "So much better," she whispered. I watched in horrified fascination as the scene unfolded exactly like my own seduction had months earlier. The gradual boundary crossing, the careful escalation, the way he made her feel special and seen while slowly introducing more intimate touch. "You're beautiful," he told her, his hands moving to her face now. "Your husband is an idiot if he can't see what's right in front of him." She had a husband, just like me. And Trey was using the same playbook, the same words, the same careful manipulation to make her feel like she was the only woman in the world who mattered to him. I couldn't watch anymore. I turned and walked quickly back toward the exit, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd witnessed. In the parking lot, I sat in my car with shaking hands, trying to process what I'd seen. How many women were there? How many lonely, vulnerable wives had Trey identified and seduced with the same techniques he'd used on me? How many women thought they were special to him, thought they had a unique connection, thought he cared about them as individuals? All those things he'd said to me, about my husband not appreciating me, about deserving better, about being incredible and beautiful and worthy of worship, had he said the same things to dozens of other women? The worst part wasn't even the betrayal, though that cut deep. The worst part was realizing how naive I'd been, how easily I'd been manipulated, how I'd confused practiced seduction techniques with genuine care and connection. I'd thought I was having an affair with someone who saw something special in me. Instead, I'd been sleeping with someone who saw an opportunity in my loneliness and exploited it with expert precision. As I drove home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. The fog of infatuation and rationalization lifted, and I could see my situation for what it really was. I was a married woman who had been having an affair with a man who made his living seducing vulnerable clients. I had risked everything for someone who saw me as interchangeable with any other lonely wife who walked through his gym. And somehow, I had to figure out how to live with that knowledge.
I didn't sleep that night.
Every time I closed my eyes, I saw images of Trey with that blonde woman, heard his voice saying the same things to her that he'd said to me. I felt sick with betrayal, but also with a deeper, more disturbing realization. I had no right to feel betrayed. Trey had never promised me exclusivity. He had never said he loved me or wanted a future with me. He had never pretended our relationship was anything more than what it was: stolen hours in private spaces, physical intimacy, without emotional commitment. I was the one who had built it up into something bigger in my mind. I was the one who had convinced myself that what we shared was special, unique, meaningful beyond the physical connection. The next morning, David left early for a breakfast meeting, and I found myself sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee I couldn't stomach, staring at my phone. I had Trey's number saved under Elite Fitness Training, another small deception in a relationship built on them. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to text him and demand an explanation, ask him how many other clients he was sleeping with, force him to admit that I was just one of many. But what would be the point? The confrontation wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo the months of lies I'd been living or restore the innocence I'd lost. Instead, I spent the day trying to imagine how to extract myself from the situation. I couldn't simply stop showing up to sessions without explanation. That would raise questions. I couldn't keep seeing him and pretend I didn't know what I knew. And I certainly couldn't continue our physical relationship knowing that I was sharing him with other women. The solution came to me that evening as I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone. I would tell him I thought we should end our training relationship. I would say that I was concerned about maintaining professional boundaries, that I felt like things had gotten too personal, and that I needed to take a step back. It was essentially the truth, just missing the detail about catching him with another client. I scheduled one final session for Thursday afternoon, not at his apartment but at the gym, in the yoga studio where everything had started. If I was going to end this, I wanted to do it in the place where I'd first compromised my values. When Thursday arrived, I felt strangely calm. I'd spent 3 days processing my emotions, the betrayal, the embarrassment, the guilt, the relief. By the time I walked into Elite Fitness, I felt ready to close this chapter of my life. Trey was waiting for me in the studio, and when he smiled that practice smile that had once made my heart race, I felt nothing but sadness for how easily I'd been fooled. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, the same way he always did. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that," I said, setting down my gym bag, but not bothering to change into workout clothes. "I've been doing some thinking, and I believe we need to end our training sessions." His expression shifted slightly, not hurt or surprised, but something more calculating. Did something happen? Did I do something wrong? "No," I lied. "It's just, I think things have gotten too complicated between us. Too personal. I need to focus on my marriage, and I can't do that while we're—" I gestured vaguely between us. He nodded slowly, and I could see him processing this information, deciding how to respond. "I understand," he said finally. "If that's what you think is best." There was no fight, no attempt to change my mind, no expression of regret at losing what we'd shared. Just professional acceptance of a business decision. "I want you to know," he said, moving closer to me, "that these past few months have been really special to me. You're an incredible woman, Vanessa. I hope you figure things out at home." Even knowing what I knew, even understanding that these were probably scripted words he'd used before, part of me wanted to believe him. Part of me wanted to ask if I was different from the others, if what we'd shared had meant something more to him than just another conquest. Instead, I just nodded. "Thank you for everything." He reached out and touched my arm gently. "If you ever change your mind, if things don't work out the way you hope they will, you know where to find me." As I drove away from Elite Fitness for the last time, I felt an odd mixture of grief and relief. I was grieving the end of something that had made me feel alive and wanted, even if it had been built on an illusion. But I was also relieved to step out of the exhausting double life I'd been living. Now I just had to figure out how to rebuild some kind of authentic relationship with my husband, how to live with the guilt of what I'd done, and how to move forward knowing that I was capable of betraying everything I thought I believed about myself. For 2 weeks after ending things with Trey, I threw myself into trying to repair my marriage. I suggested date nights, cooked David's favorite meals, initiated conversations about our future plans. I bought new lingerie and made an effort to be more physically affectionate. I even brought up the possibility of couples therapy, framing it as a way to strengthen our relationship after the difficult year we'd had. David responded to these efforts with polite appreciation but no real engagement. He seemed puzzled by my sudden attention, like he didn't quite trust this version of me that was trying so hard to connect with him. "You've been different lately," he said one evening as we were getting ready for bed. "More intense, I guess. Is everything okay?" "I just realized we've been drifting apart," I said, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "I want us to be close again." He nodded and kissed my forehead in a way that felt more obligatory than affectionate. "That's good. I want that too." But it was clear that he didn't know how to want it, or maybe he'd forgotten how to try. The distance between us had become so familiar that closeness felt foreign and uncomfortable. Still, I kept trying. I kept hoping that if I could just be the wife I should have been all along, if I could just love him better and more consistently, we could find our way back to each other. I might have succeeded, or at least convinced myself I was succeeding, if it weren't for what happened on a Saturday morning in mid-March. David had been talking about upgrading his tablet for months, and I'd finally convinced him to buy one as an early birthday present for himself. He was setting it up at the kitchen table while I made breakfast, syncing it with his phone and our shared cloud accounts so he could access his photos and documents from the new device. I was scrambling eggs when I heard him make a strange sound. Not quite a gasp, not quite a groan, but something that made me turn around immediately. He was staring at the tablet screen with an expression I'd never seen before, confusion mixed with horror, mixed with something that might have been disgust. "What is it?" I asked, though something in his posture made my stomach start to sink even before he answered. "What is this?" he asked, turning the tablet toward me. On the screen was a photo I'd forgotten existed. It was a mirror selfie from Trey's apartment, him behind me, both of us disheveled and clearly post-intimacy, his arms around my waist, both of us smiling at the camera with the lazy satisfaction of people who had just spent the afternoon in bed together. The photo had automatically synced from my phone to our shared photo stream months ago, but it had been buried among hundreds of other images, workout photos, food pictures, random screenshots. I'd forgotten it was there, forgotten that everything on my phone was accessible to David through our family sharing settings. "David," I started, but he was already scrolling through other photos, finding more evidence of my double life. Pictures of Trey and me at his apartment. Screenshots of text conversations that were flirtatious and intimate. Photos I'd taken of myself in lingerie that I'd sent to someone who wasn't my husband. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of eggs burning in the pan behind me. "How long?" David asked, his voice eerily calm. How long, Vanessa?" I turned off the burner and sat down across from him at the table, my hands shaking. "About 4 months. 4 months." He said it like he was testing how the words felt in his mouth. "For months you've been sleeping with someone else." "It's over," I said quickly. "It ended 2 weeks ago. I realized I'd made a terrible mistake, and I ended it. That's why I've been trying so hard to." "To what?" "To make up for fucking your personal trainer." I'd never heard David use that tone before, never heard him speak with such raw anger and contempt. It was worse than yelling would have been. "I know you're angry," I said, though the words seemed inadequate for what was happening. "I know I've hurt you terribly, but I want to fix this. I want to make it right." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Make it right? You've been lying to me for 4 months. Every time you said you were going to the gym, every time you came home and asked about my day like nothing had happened, every time we had sex while you were sleeping with someone else. All of that was a lie." "I know," I whispered. "Do you?" He leaned forward across the table, his eyes intense in a way that made me want to look away. "Because I don't think you do. I don't think you have any idea what this feels like." He was right. I'd been so focused on my own guilt and my own efforts to repair the damage that I hadn't really considered what it felt like to be in his position, to discover that your partner had been living a completely separate life, had been intimate with someone else while pretending everything was normal at home. "Tell me about him," David said. "David, I don't think." "Tell me about him." His voice was steel. "I want to know who my wife has been fucking instead of me." The crudeness of his language was so unlike him that it felt like a slap. But I realized he was entitled to his anger, entitled to ask questions, entitled to understand what had happened to his marriage. His name is Trey, I said quietly. He's a personal trainer at Elite Fitness. The gym where you've been going for stress relief and to work on yourself. I nodded, hearing my own excuses quoted back to me with bitter sarcasm. And you've been meeting him where? In his car? At hotels? At the gym, sometimes. And he has an apartment downtown. David absorbed this information with that same eerie calm. So, you've been going to his apartment, planning these meetings, getting dressed up for them, lying to me about where you were going. Again, I nodded. And what did you tell him about me? About us? About our marriage? This was the question I'd been dreading. Because the truth was I had talked about David with Trey. I had complained about feeling neglected and unappreciated. I had shared intimate details about our relationship, our struggles, our sex life. I had allowed Trey to comfort me and validate my feelings of resentment toward my husband. I told him we were having problems. I said carefully. What kind of problems? David, please.
What kind
Of problems. I took a shaky breath. I told him I felt invisible, that you'd been distant since the miscarriages, that we weren't connecting anymore. So, you discussed our personal business with your lover. The word lover hit me like a physical blow. It made the relationship sound romantic and meaningful in a way that felt false now that I understood what Trey really was. Yes, I admitted. David stood up from the table and walked to the window, his back to me. For several minutes, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, he turned around. I want you to leave.
What?
I want you to pack a bag and stay somewhere else for a while. I need time to think about this without you here trying to manage my reaction. David, we should talk about this. We should work through this together. Together? He looked at me like I'd said something incomprehensible. You made this decision without me. You carried on this relationship without me. You ended it without me. What exactly do you want to work through together? I didn't have an answer for that. Pack a bag, Vanessa. Go stay with your sister or get a hotel room. I don't care, but I can't look at you right now. As I went upstairs to gather some clothes, I could hear him in the kitchen, probably cleaning up the breakfast I'd abandoned when our world fell apart. The normalcy of the sound, dishes clattering, water running, felt surreal given the magnitude of what had just happened. I'd known this moment would come eventually. I'd known that secrets this big couldn't stay hidden forever. But I'd somehow imagined it would be different, that I'd have more control over how the truth came out, that I'd be able to frame the conversation in a way that emphasized my remorse and my commitment to rebuilding our relationship. Instead, I was packing a suitcase while my husband processed the discovery that his wife had been living a double life for months. As I pulled out of our driveway 20 minutes later, I realized that this might be the last time I left this house as David's wife. The last time I could call it home. The affair was over, but its consequences were just beginning. I checked into a hotel downtown, not far from Trey's apartment building, though I had no intention of seeing him again. The irony of the location wasn't lost on me. I was hiding from the consequences of my affair in the same neighborhood where I'd carried it out. The first few days were a blur of phone calls and tears. I called in sick to work, unable to imagine sitting through meetings and pretending everything was normal. I called my sister Emma, but couldn't bring myself to tell her the whole truth. I just said David and I were going through a rough patch, and I needed somewhere to stay for a few days. You can stay with us, she offered immediately. The guest room is always available. But I couldn't face Emma's inevitable questions, her attempts to help me analyze the situation and find solutions. I couldn't pretend this was a normal marital disagreement that could be resolved with better communication and compromise. David didn't call.
He didn't text.
For 3 days, I heard nothing from him, and the silence felt worse than anger would have. On Thursday, the day that had been my regular appointment with Trey, I found myself thinking about what I would be doing if my life hadn't imploded. I'd probably be getting ready for our session, choosing an outfit that I knew he'd appreciate, anticipating the attention and validation that had become like a drug to me. Instead, I was sitting in a sterile hotel room, eating takeout Chinese food, and trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that I'd systematically destroyed. My phone rang that evening. David's name on the caller ID made my heart race. "Hello," I answered, not sure if I should sound hopeful or contrite or neutral. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble. "About us, about what happened, about what comes next." "Okay," I said carefully. "I need to understand something. Why him? Why this particular person?" I'd been dreading this question, but I'd also been preparing for it. He paid attention to me. He made me feel seen, appreciated. He noticed when I was struggling, and he made me feel like I mattered. There was a long pause. "And I didn't." "You were dealing with your own grief about the babies we lost. You were working all the time, staying late, coming home exhausted. We weren't talking about anything real anymore, weren't connecting. I felt like I was disappearing. So, you found someone who would see you." "Yes," I said quietly. "Did you love him?" The question caught me off guard. I thought I did. But now I think I was just in love with the way he made me feel about myself. "And how did he make you feel?" "Beautiful. Wanted. Important. Like I was worth paying attention to." Another long pause. "And now?" Now I realized that it wasn't real. That he was probably seeing other women, saying the same things to them. That I was just another lonely wife he could manipulate. "You found out he was seeing other people?" I hadn't meant to reveal that detail, but now that it was out, I couldn't take it back. "Yes." "How did you find out?" "I saw him with another client. At the gym. He was doing the same things with her that he'd done with me. Using the same words, the same techniques." "Jesus, Vanessa." "I know," I said, starting to cry. "I know how stupid I was. How naive. How easily I was fooled." "So you ended it because you realized you weren't special to him?" The question stung because it highlighted something I hadn't wanted to admit to myself, that I might not have ended the affair if I hadn't discovered I was sharing Trey with other women. "That's part of it," I admitted. But also because I realized I was risking everything real for something that was completely fake. "Everything real," David repeated. "Is that what our marriage is to you? Real?" "Yes," I said immediately. "Whatever problems we have, whatever distance there's been between us, our marriage is real. Our history is real. The love we've shared is real. What I had with him was just an illusion. But it was an illusion you chose over reality." I didn't have an answer for that because he was right. Given the choice between working on our marriage and escaping into a fantasy, I'd chosen the fantasy. "David," I said finally, "I know I've destroyed your trust. I know I've hurt you in a way that might be unforgivable. But I want to try to rebuild this if you'll let me. I want to figure out how to be the wife you deserve." "I don't know if that's possible," he said quietly. "I keep thinking about all the times you lied to me. All the times you came home from being with him and acted normal. All the times we were intimate while you were being intimate with someone else. I don't know how to get past that." "Maybe we could try counseling," I suggested. "Together and separately. Maybe we could figure out how to work through this with professional help." "Maybe," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. "I need more time to think. I need to figure out if I can forgive this, if I can trust you again." "How much time?" "I don't know. Weeks, maybe months. This isn't the kind of thing you get over quickly." After he hung up, I sat in the hotel room feeling a mixture of hope and despair. Hope because he was at least willing to consider trying to work through this. Despair because I could hear in his voice how deeply I'd wounded him, how thoroughly I'd shaken his faith in our relationship. Over the next few weeks, we had several more conversations, stilted, painful discussions about practical matters like bills and schedules, and deeper conversations about what had gone wrong in our marriage and whether it could be repaired. David asked hard questions that forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my choices and my motivations. He wanted to understand not just what I'd done, but why I'd been capable of doing it. He wanted to know if I was the kind of person who would cheat again if things got difficult, or if this had been an aberration brought on by specific circumstances. I didn't have good answers to most of his questions because I was still figuring out the answers myself. What I didn't know was that the affair had been a symptom of deeper problems, not just in our marriage, but in my own understanding of myself and what I needed to feel fulfilled. I'd looked to Trey to fill voids in my life that weren't his responsibility to fill, and I'd compromised my values in the process. I started seeing a therapist individually, trying to understand how I'd become someone capable of sustaining a months-long deception. I joined a support group for people dealing with the aftermath of infidelity, where I met other women and men who'd made similar choices and were trying to rebuild their lives. But mostly I waited. I waited for David to decide whether our marriage was worth saving. I waited to find out if forgiveness was possible, if trust could be rebuilt, if love could survive this level of betrayal. And I lived with the knowledge that the answer might be no. 3 weeks after David discovered my affair, I was still living in the hotel, still waiting for him to decide whether he wanted to try to work on our marriage. We'd established a routine of talking every few days, awkward, careful conversations that felt like negotiations between strangers rather than discussions between husband and wife. I'd started seeing a therapist twice a week, and she was helping me understand the deeper issues that had made me vulnerable to Trey's manipulation. We talked about my need for external validation, my tendency to avoid difficult conversations, my pattern of seeking escape rather than facing problems directly. Affairs are often less about the other person and more about what that person represents, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. It sounds like Trey represented feeling valued, desired, seen, all things you felt were missing from your marriage. But David used to make me feel those things, I said. In the beginning, he did see me, value me. What changed? Sometimes relationships settle into patterns that feel safe, but aren't necessarily nurturing, she said. The question is whether both people are willing to recognize those patterns and work to change them. That was the question, wasn't it? Whether David would be willing to examine not just my betrayal, but the circumstances that had made me susceptible to it in the first place. My answer came on a Thursday evening when he called with more urgency in his voice than I'd heard since the discovery. "We need to talk," he said. "In person. Can you come to the house?" "Of course," I said, my heart racing. "When?"
"Now."
"There's something I need to show you." The drive to our house felt surreal. I'd been gone for 3 weeks, but it felt like months. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed David's car wasn't alone. There was another vehicle parked behind it, a red sedan I didn't recognize. David met me at the front door, his expression grim. "Whose car is that?" I asked. "Someone you need to meet," he said, stepping aside to let me in. In our living room, sitting on the couch where David and I used to watch movies together, was a woman I'd never seen before. She was brunette, probably in her late 20s, attractive but tired-looking. She stood up nervously when I walked in. "Vanessa," David said. "This is Jessica. Jessica, this is my wife." Jessica extended her hand tentatively. "I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances," she said. I shook her hand, completely confused about what was happening. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Who are you?" David and Jessica exchanged a look, and he gestured for both of us to sit down. "Jessica is also a member of Elite Fitness," David said. "She's also married, and she's also been having an affair with Trey." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked at Jessica, seeing recognition dawn in her eyes as she realized who I was. "Oh my God," she said softly. "You're the woman from the photos." "What photos?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. David opened his laptop, which was sitting on the coffee table. "Jessica came to see me yesterday. She found my contact information through the gym's member directory and tracked me down because she wanted me to know something about your trainer." He turned the laptop screen toward me, and I saw what appeared to be a private Instagram account. The username was something like private_training_t, and the profile picture was a silhouette of a muscular man. "Trey has been documenting his conquests," David said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Jessica found this account when she was trying to figure out how many other women he was seeing. As David scrolled through the account, I felt sick to my stomach. There were photos of Trey with multiple women, some faces obscured, some clearly identifiable. Pictures taken in the yoga studio, at the gym, in his apartment, in hotel rooms. And there were photos of me. Several photos of me, including some I didn't even know he'd taken. There are at least 12 women on here, Jessica said quietly. 12 that we can identify from the photos. All of them appear to be married. All of them are gym members. I couldn't speak. I was staring at a picture of myself from his apartment, one where I was sleeping, completely unaware that he was taking my photo to add to his collection. He's been running a systematic operation, David continued, targeting married women who seem vulnerable, using the same techniques on all of them, documenting the affairs for some kind of twisted trophy collection. I think he might be selling the photos, Jessica added. Or planning to. Some of the images have been posted to other accounts that look like they might be, I don't know, revenge porn sites or something similar. The room started spinning. Not only had I been betrayed and manipulated, but my most intimate moments had been photographed without my knowledge and were potentially being distributed online. How did you find this? I asked Jessica, my voice barely above a whisper. I got suspicious when I realized I wasn't the only one, she said. I started following him on social media, paying attention to who liked and commented on his posts. I noticed patterns, certain women who seemed to interact with him in ways that felt too familiar. So I started digging. Jessica's husband doesn't know yet, David said. She wanted to gather information before deciding how to handle her situation. But she thought I should know what kind of person you'd been involved with. I looked at Jessica with a mixture of gratitude and horror. How long? I asked her. About 6 months, she said. It started the same way as yours, I'm sure. He was so attentive, so understanding. He made me feel like he could see right into my soul, like he understood me better than my husband did. And then you found out about the others. She nodded. I saw him with another client, having what looked like an intimate conversation. So I started investigating. Have you confronted him? Not yet. I wanted to talk to some of his other victims first, see how widespread this was. Victims. That's what we were. Not women who'd had affairs, not people who'd made bad choices, but victims of a predator who'd systematically targeted and exploited vulnerable married women. I'm going to the police, Jessica said. Taking intimate photos of someone without their consent is illegal. And if he's distributing them, that's even worse. I nodded, though the thought of law enforcement getting involved, of having to explain my affair to police officers and potentially testify in court, made me feel physically ill. There's something else, David said. Jessica found evidence that he's done this before at other gyms. Apparently, he was fired from his previous job for inappropriate relationships with clients. Elite Fitness either didn't check his references thoroughly, or they didn't care. The scope of the betrayal kept expanding. I hadn't just been naive about Trey's feelings for me. I'd been targeted by someone who made his living exploiting women like me. After Jessica left, David and I sat in our living room in silence for a long time. The revelation about Trey's systematic manipulation had changed something fundamental about how we both understood what had happened to our marriage. I'm not saying this excuses what you did, David said finally. You still chose to have an affair. You still lied to me for months. You still betrayed our vows. I know, I said. But knowing that you were deliberately targeted, that this wasn't just a random attraction or a momentary lapse in judgment, it helps me understand how it happened. I looked at him, afraid to hope that this new information might change his perspective on our future. You were vulnerable, he continued, and he identified that vulnerability and exploited it. That doesn't make you blameless, but it does make you a victim of something larger than just an affair. What does that mean for us?
I asked.
He was quiet for a long moment. It means I think we should try counseling. Together. It means I think we should try to figure out how to rebuild this marriage, how to make it strong enough that neither of us is vulnerable to this kind of manipulation in the future. For the first time in weeks, I felt something that might have been hope. But, he continued, and my heart sank. It's going to be a long process. And there are no guarantees. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you completely again. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened. I understand, I said, though I wasn't sure I did understand. I wasn't sure anyone could understand until they'd been in this position. And we're going to have to deal with the legal situation. If Jessica presses charges, you might have to testify. There might be media attention if this becomes a bigger story about the gym or about predatory trainers. The thought made my stomach clench, but I knew he was right. The consequences of my affair were going to extend far beyond our marriage. I'll do whatever it takes, I said. Counseling, testifying, facing whatever comes. I'll do whatever it takes to try to make this right. David nodded slowly. Then come home. We'll start there. Moving back home felt like entering a house where strangers lived. Everything looked the same. Our furniture, our photos, our carefully chosen decorations, but the atmosphere was completely different. David was polite but distant, like a courteous roommate rather than a husband. We started couples counseling the following week with Dr. Sarah Chin, a specialist in infidelity recovery. The first session was brutal. For 90 minutes, David and I sat across from each other in uncomfortable chairs, dissecting the corpse of our marriage while a stranger took notes. David, can you tell me how you're feeling about Vanessa's return home?
Dr. Chin asked.
Confused, he said, not looking at me. Part of me wants to try to fix this, and part of me thinks I'm crazy for even considering it. Every time I look at her, I think about her with him. Every time she says she loves me, I wonder if she said the same thing to him. I never told him I loved him, I said quickly. But you showed it, David replied, his voice sharp. You chose him over me hundreds of times. Every lie you told me, every session you went to, every time you came home and pretended everything was normal, those were all choices to prioritize him over our marriage.
Dr. Chin turned to me.
Vanessa, how do you respond to that? He's right, I said, fighting back tears. I did choose the affair over my marriage, over and over again. I told myself I was protecting David by keeping it secret, but really I was protecting myself. I was being selfish. What would you have needed from David to make different choices?
Dr. Chin asked.
It was a question I'd been grappling with for weeks. I needed to feel seen, I said slowly. After the miscarriages, I felt like I'd failed at the most basic thing a woman is supposed to do. And David, he dealt with his grief by working more, being out of the house more. I felt like he couldn't bear to look at me, because I reminded him of what we'd lost. David shifted in his chair. That's not. I wasn't avoiding you, because you reminded me of the babies. I was working more because I didn't know how to help you, and I thought providing for us, being successful, was the only thing I could control. But you never told me that, I said. We never talked about how we were each dealing with the losses. We just retreated into separate corners. So you retreated into someone else's arms. Yes, I admitted. And that was wrong. I should have insisted we talk. I should have suggested counseling then before it got to this point. Instead, I found someone who made me feel better about myself temporarily, and I convinced myself that was enough. Dr. Chin nodded. It sounded like you were both grieving and coping in ways that created distance rather than intimacy. David, you threw yourself into work. Vanessa, you eventually sought connection outside the marriage. Neither of those strategies addressed the underlying issues. Over the following weeks, our sessions began to reveal patterns that had existed in our relationship long before the affair. We'd both been conflict avoidant, preferring to maintain surface harmony rather than address problems directly. We'd both struggled to communicate our needs clearly, assuming the other person should intuitively understand what we required. The miscarriages had exposed these weaknesses, but hadn't created them. The affair was a symptom, Dr. Chin explained during one session, but it wasn't the disease. The disease was a relationship structure that left both of you feeling unsupported and misunderstood. Meanwhile, the legal situation with Trey was developing rapidly. Jessica had indeed filed a police report, and investigators had uncovered evidence of his systematic targeting of married women across multiple gyms over several years. Elite Fitness was facing lawsuits from dozens of women who claimed the gym had enabled his predatory behavior. I had to give a statement to detectives describing my relationship with Trey and confirming that he'd taken intimate photos without my consent. It was humiliating to explain the details of my affair to law enforcement officers, but it was also oddly liberating to name what had happened to me as exploitation rather than just poor judgment. He had a whole playbook, Detective Rodriguez explained to me during my interview. Same techniques, same progression, same endgame with every woman. He targeted wives who seemed unhappy or vulnerable, built trust through professional interaction, gradually increased intimacy while making each woman feel special and chosen. How many women? I asked. We've identified 47 so far, going back about 8 years. Different cities, different gyms, same pattern. 47 women. I felt sick thinking about how many marriages had been damaged, how many families had been torn apart by one man's systematic manipulation. The media attention was minimal, but still uncomfortable. A few local news stations picked up the story as part of broader coverage about the gym's legal troubles, but my name wasn't mentioned. Still, people in our social circle began to figure out that David and I were among the affected couples, and I had to deal with the awkwardness of friends and acquaintances who didn't know what to say. Some people were sympathetic, viewing me as a victim of manipulation. Others were clearly judgmental, believing that being targeted didn't excuse my choices. Both reactions were difficult to handle. But slowly, painfully, David and I began to make progress in therapy. I need to understand something, he said during a session about 6 weeks after I'd moved back home. When you were with him, did you think about me? Did you feel guilty? Yes, I said immediately. Constantly. Every time I was with him, every time I lied to you, every time I came home and pretended everything was normal. The guilt was eating me alive. Then, why didn't you stop? I've been dreading this question because the answer revealed something ugly about my character. Because the guilt was still easier to deal with than the loneliness I felt in our marriage. Being with him made me feel alive again, even though I knew it was wrong. The temporary relief from feeling invisible was worth the long-term consequences. So you chose feeling good over doing right?
Yes.
And I hate that about myself. I hate that I'm the kind of person who could make that choice. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Vanessa, understanding why you made those choices doesn't mean accepting them as inevitable. But it does help us identify what needs to change to prevent similar situations in the future. What needs to change is that I need to handle my problems directly instead of running away from them, I said. I need to communicate with David instead of seeking validation elsewhere. I need to be someone who chooses integrity even when it's difficult. And David, Dr. Chen said, turning to him, what needs to change on your end? He was quiet for a long moment. I need to be more present in our marriage. I need to notice when Vanessa is struggling instead of assuming everything is fine. I need to create space for difficult conversations instead of avoiding them. Are you willing to do that work? I think so, he said slowly. I think I want to try. It wasn't a declaration of forgiveness or a promise that everything would be okay. But it was a commitment to the process of rebuilding, and for now, that felt like enough. 6 months after David discovered my affair, we were still in counseling twice a week, still navigating the complicated process of rebuilding trust. Some days were better than others. Some days, we could have normal conversations about work or weekend plans or what to watch on Netflix. Other days, the weight of what I'd done seemed to fill every room in our house. David had good days and bad days too. On good days, he could be affectionate, even intimate. He'd hold my hand during movies or kiss me goodbye when he left for work. On bad days, he could barely look at me without his expression clouding over with hurt and anger. Healing isn't linear, Dr. Chen reminded us regularly. There will be setbacks, triggers, moments when it feels like you're back at square one. That's normal and expected. One of my triggers was driving past Elite Fitness. I'd found a new gym across town, but sometimes I'd accidentally take my old route and see the building where everything had started. Each time, I'd be hit with a complex mixture of shame, regret, and, disturbingly, nostalgia for how alive I'd felt during those stolen hours. One of David's triggers was my phone. Even though I'd given him complete access to my messages, calls, and social media accounts, he still tensed up whenever I received a text or spent time scrolling through apps. I understood his anxiety, but it was difficult to feel constantly monitored, like I was on probation in my own marriage. Trust is earned through consistency over time, Dr. Chen explained when I complained about feeling like I was under surveillance. David's hypervigilance is a natural response to betrayal. As you demonstrate trustworthiness through your actions, that will gradually decrease. How long? I asked. How long will it take for him to trust me again? There's no timeline, she said. Some couples rebuild trust relatively quickly, within a year or two. Others take much longer, or never fully get there. It depends on too many variables to predict. The legal case against Trey was moving forward slowly. He'd been arrested and charged with multiple crimes related to the non-consensual photography and distribution of intimate images. His trial was scheduled for the following year, and I would likely have to testify. Elite Fitness had fired him and settled most of the civil lawsuits out of court, but the scandal had effectively destroyed the business. The gym closed permanently, and several other trainers were under investigation for similar behavior. I should feel vindicated, I told Dr. Martinez, my individual therapist, during one of our sessions. Trey is facing consequences for what he did. The gym that enabled him is gone. Justice is being served. But you don't feel vindicated? I feel empty, I guess. Like, even though he's being punished, it doesn't undo the damage. My marriage is still broken. I still made choices that hurt the person I love most. His consequences don't erase my responsibility. That's actually a healthy perspective, Dr. Martinez said. It shows you're taking ownership of your part in this situation rather than seeing yourself purely as a victim. But I was a victim, right? I was manipulated, targeted, exploited. You were both, she said. You were victimized by someone who systematically manipulated you. And you also made choices that betrayed your values and hurt your husband. Both things can be true simultaneously. This was the hardest part of recovery, learning to hold the complexity of being both victim and perpetrator, both wronged and wrongdoing. At home, David and I were slowly learning how to be married to each other again. We'd established new routines designed to increase transparency and connection. We had dinner together every night without phones or television, focusing entirely on conversation. We went to bed at the same time, even if one of us wanted to stay up later. We scheduled weekly relationship meetings where we could discuss any issues or concerns in a structured way. It feels artificial sometimes, David said during one of our counseling sessions. Like we're following a script for how to be married instead of just being married. That's temporary, Dr. Chen assured him. You're rebuilding intimacy from scratch, which means being very intentional about creating opportunities for connection. Eventually, these behaviors will become natural again. Will they? I asked. Or will we always be this careful with each other? Some couples do maintain a higher level of intentionality after recovering from infidelity, she said. They see it as a positive change, being more deliberate about nurturing their relationship instead of taking it for granted. 7 months after the discovery, David and I had our first real fight since I'd moved back home. It was about something completely mundane. I'd forgotten to pay a credit card bill on time, and we'd been charged a late fee. But his reaction was disproportionate to the offense. How can you be so careless, he said, waving the statement at me. How can I trust you with anything important if you can't even handle basic responsibilities? It's a $30 late fee, David. I made a mistake. It's not the end of the world. It's not about the money, he said, his voice rising. It's about the fact that I can't rely on you. First, you lied to me for months about having an affair, and now you can't even be trusted to pay bills on time. That's when I realized the fight wasn't really about the credit card bill. It was about the fact that every small mistake I made now felt loaded with larger meaning about my character and trustworthiness. You're right, I said, sitting down at the kitchen table where we seemed to have all our serious conversations. You're right that you can't trust me completely yet. And you're right that I need to be more careful about everything, not just the big things. He sat down across from me, his anger deflating into exhaustion. I hate this, he said quietly. I hate that I can't give you the benefit of the doubt anymore. I hate that every mistake feels like evidence that you haven't really changed. I hate it too, I said. I hate that I put us in this position. I hate that I made choices that damaged your ability to trust me. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the weight of what recovery really meant. Not just forgiveness, but the slow, difficult work of rebuilding confidence in each other. I want to trust you again, David said finally. I want to believe that you've learned from this, that you're committed to being different. But wanting it and being able to do it aren't the same thing. I know, I said. And I know that my job is to prove myself through my actions, not just my words. Even if it takes years. That night, for the first time since the affair, we made love without it feeling like an obligation or a test. It felt like two people who were choosing each other despite the damage, choosing to rebuild something that had been broken. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the same as it had been before. But it was real, and it was ours, and it was a beginning. 1 year after David discovered my affair, we were in a different place, but not necessarily a better one. We were more honest with each other than we'd ever been, more intentional about our relationship, more aware of each other's needs and vulnerabilities. But we were also more fragile, more careful, more conscious of how quickly things could fall apart. We're like a bone that's been broken and healed, I said to Dr. Chin during one of our sessions. Maybe stronger in some ways, but always aware of where the break was. Is that necessarily a bad thing? She asked. David and I looked at each other, a wordless communication that had developed over months of intensive therapy. No, he said slowly. I think maybe it's more honest. We know now that marriage isn't automatic, that it requires constant attention and care. We can't take it for granted anymore. The legal proceedings had finally concluded. Trey had been sentenced to 2 years in prison for invasion of privacy and distribution of intimate images without consent. Dozens of his victims had testified or provided impact statements, and the judge had called his behavior a systematic violation of trust that damaged families and destroyed marriages. I'd testified via video conference, describing how he'd targeted and manipulated me. It was difficult to speak publicly about the affair, but it was also empowering to name what had happened as exploitation rather than just poor judgment. Do you feel like justice was served? David asked me after the sentencing. I feel like he was held accountable, I said. But justice? I don't think there's really justice for this kind of harm. The damage he did to relationships, to families, that can't be undone by a prison sentence. We'd started seeing Dr. Chun less frequently, once a week instead of twice, and we were both in individual therapy less often too. The crisis phase of recovery was over, but the maintenance phase would probably last the rest of our marriage. What's different now? Dr. Martinez asked during one of our monthly individual sessions. Everything and nothing, I said. David and I talk more, but carefully. We're more affectionate, but deliberately. We trust each other more than we did 6 months ago, but less than we did 2 years ago. Do you think you'll ever get back to where you were before the affair? It was a question I'd been pondering for months. I don't think so, I said finally. And maybe that's okay. Where we were before wasn't actually that healthy, we just didn't know it at the time. We were taking each other for granted, not communicating well, avoiding difficult conversations. So, in some ways, the affair forced you to build a better relationship. I hate that narrative, I said immediately. I hate the idea that betraying my husband was somehow good for a marriage in the long run. It wasn't worth the pain it caused. But can you acknowledge that some positive changes have come from working through this crisis? I considered this carefully. Yes. We're better at talking to each other now. We're more aware of each other's emotional needs. We don't assume we know what the other person is thinking or feeling. We're more intentional about maintaining our connection. Those are significant improvements. They are. But they came at an enormous cost. David's trust, my self-respect, our sense of security in the relationship. I wish we could have learned those lessons without me having to destroy everything first. At home, we were slowly finding our rhythm as a couple again. Some aspects of our relationship felt completely new. We were more open about our individual struggles, more direct about what we needed from each other, more willing to have difficult conversations in real time rather than avoiding them. Other aspects felt familiar in the best way. David still made me laugh with his dry observations about people we encountered. I still loved the way he analyzed movies and books with intense seriousness. We still enjoyed cooking together on weekends, though we were more likely now to talk about meaningful things while we chopped vegetables and stirred sauces. Do you think about him? David asked me one evening as we were cleaning up after dinner. The question came out of nowhere, but I'd learned not to be defensive when his curiosity or insecurities surfaced unexpectedly. Sometimes, I said honestly, not romantically, not with longing. But I think about how naive I was, how easily I was manipulated. I think about what I learned about myself through the experience. What did you learn? That I'm more selfish than I wanted to believe. That I'm capable of sustained deception when it serves my interests. That I need external validation more than is healthy. I paused, considering. But also that I'm capable of doing hard work to change, that I can take responsibility for my mistakes, that I love you enough to fight for our marriage even when it would be easier to give up. He nodded thoughtfully. Do you regret it? It was a complicated question. I regret hurting you. I regret the lies, the betrayal, the damage to our relationship. I regret that I was so easily fooled by someone who saw me as a conquest rather than a person. But I don't regret learning who I really am underneath the version of myself I was trying to maintain. I don't regret discovering that our marriage needed work. I don't regret being forced to confront problems I was avoiding. Even though you could have confronted those problems without having an affair?
Yes.
Even though there were better ways to handle everything. We'd been having versions of this conversation for months, circling around the central question of whether growth that comes through destruction is worth the cost. I still didn't have a definitive answer. What I did know was that I was a different person than I'd been 2 years earlier. More self-aware, more honest, more willing to sit with discomfort rather than escape it. Whether that growth justified the pain I'd caused was something I'd probably wrestle with for the rest of my life. I love you, David said as we finished loading the dishwasher. Not the same way I loved you before, but maybe in a more real way. With my eyes open to who you actually are, not who I assumed you were. I love you too, I said. And I'm grateful every day that you were willing to try to work through this instead of walking away. Some days I wish I had walked away, he said with characteristic honesty. It would have been simpler. But you didn't. No, I didn't. Because simple isn't always the same as right. 3 years after David discovered my affair, we were sitting in Dr. Chen's office for what we decided would be our final couples therapy session. Not because our marriage was perfect, but because we developed the tools to navigate challenges on our own. How would you describe your relationship now?
Dr. Chen asked.
David spoke first. Stronger but scarred. More honest but more careful. We know each other better now, both the good and the difficult parts. I feel like we're married to who we actually are instead of who we pretended to be, I added. It's messy, but more authentic. Do you trust each other? Mostly, David said. There are still moments when I feel anxious about Vanessa's whereabouts or when she seems distant. But those moments are fewer and less intense than they used to be. I trust David completely. That's actually healthy, Dr. Chen noted. Overconfidence in your own character can be dangerous. Understanding your vulnerabilities helps you protect against them. We'd been through so much together. The legal proceedings, the social awkwardness, the slow rebuilding of intimacy, the countless conversations about trust and forgiveness. We'd also experienced joy again. Vacations where we genuinely enjoyed each other's company, dinner parties with friends who had no idea about our history, quiet evenings at home that felt peaceful rather than tense. What advice would you give to other couples dealing with infidelity?
Dr. Chen asked.
That it's possible to recover, David said, but it's not guaranteed and it's not easy. It requires both people to be willing to examine their own contributions to the problems in the relationship, not just focus on the betrayal itself. And that recovery doesn't mean going back to how things were, I added. It means building something new with the knowledge of what went wrong before. 6 months earlier, David and I had made a decision that surprised everyone who knew about our history. We'd started trying to have a baby again. Not because we thought a child would fix our marriage, but because we'd reached a point where we trusted our relationship enough to expand our family. I was 4 months pregnant now, and this time felt completely different from my earlier pregnancies. We were cautious but hopeful, realistic about the possibility of loss, but not paralyzed by it. We talked openly about our fears and excitement, supported each other through the anxiety of doctor's appointments, celebrated small milestones together. Are you worried about how parenthood might affect your relationship?
Dr. Chen asked.
Of course, I said. But we're also more prepared for it now. We know how to communicate under stress, how to support each other through difficult times, how to address problems before they become crises. We know that marriage requires constant attention, David added. We won't make the mistake again of assuming everything is fine just because we're not fighting. As we left Dr. Chen's office for the last time, I felt a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. Gratitude for how far we'd come, for David's willingness to forgive, for the tools we developed to maintain our relationship. Trepidation about facing future challenges without professional support, about whether we'd really learn enough to handle whatever came next. Do you think we'll make it? I asked David as we walked to our cars in the parking lot. I think we'll make it, he said. Not because it's easy, but because we both keep choosing to try. That evening, as we sat together on our couch, the same couch where I'd once planned lies to cover my affair, I reflected on how much had changed. I was no longer the woman who had sought validation outside her marriage. David was no longer the man who assumed silence meant everything was okay. We were two people who had learned the hard way that love isn't enough to sustain a marriage. That commitment, honesty, communication, and consistent effort were equally important. That trust could be broken and rebuilt, but that the rebuilt version would always carry the memory of the break. What are you thinking about? David asked, noticing my reflective mood. How different everything is, I said. 3 years ago, I thought my life was falling apart. Now I think maybe it was just falling into a truer shape. He squeezed my hand. I wouldn't recommend our path to anyone else. No, I agreed. But I'm grateful we walked it together. Outside, it was starting to rain, the kind of gentle spring rain that makes everything smell fresh and clean. Inside, David and I sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that sometimes the only way through a crisis is straight through the middle of it, that sometimes the only way to rebuild something better is to first acknowledge everything that was broken. My affair with Trey felt like something that had happened to a different person in a different life. The woman who had been so easily manipulated, who had lied so smoothly, who had prioritized temporary validation over lasting love. She was still part of me, but she wasn't who I was anymore. I was someone who had learned that integrity is a choice you make every day, not a character trait you either possess or lack. Someone who had discovered that marriage is a practice, not a destination. Someone who had found that forgiveness is less about forgetting and more about choosing love despite the memory of hurt. 3 years later, I was still learning how to be worthy of the second chance I'd been given. Some days I succeeded, and some days I fell short. But every day, I chose to try again. And that, I had learned, was enough. If you're listening to this story because you're in a similar situation, whether you're the one who strayed or the one who was betrayed, I want you to know that healing is possible, but it's not guaranteed, and it's not quick. If you're tempted to have an affair, or if you're already involved in one, please understand that the temporary relief from loneliness or validation you're seeking will come at a cost you can't fully calculate in advance. The person you think you're protecting by keeping secrets is actually the person you're hurting most. If you've been betrayed, please know that your pain is valid and your anger is justified. Whether you choose to stay or leave, whether you choose to forgive or not, you deserve to make that decision based on your own values and needs, not on what others think you should do. And if you're in the long, difficult process of rebuilding after betrayal, as the betrayer or the betrayed, please be patient with yourself and each other. Healing is not linear. There will be setbacks and breakthroughs, good days and terrible days, moments of hope and moments of despair. What I learned is that the question isn't whether you can go back to how things were before. You can't. The question is whether you can build something new that acknowledges the past while creating space for a different future. David and I are still building that future together, one choice at a time. It's not perfect, and it's not easy, but it's real in a way our marriage never was before. We love each other with full knowledge of our flaws and our capacity for both great love and great harm. 3 years later, I can say that while I will always regret the choices I made, I'm grateful for who we've become in the aftermath. We're not the same people who got married 8 years ago, and we're not the same couple whose marriage nearly ended 3 years ago. We're something new, something harder one, something built on truth rather than assumption. And on most days, that feels like enough. Please, please don't give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to Love Lies Diaries. Thank you.